welcome to the university and to our wonderful hidden gem, our art museum here. If this is your first time visiting the university or first time visiting the art museum, welcome, and don't be a stranger. Come back and visit this special and precious space when you have a moment. But importantly, it's a welcome to the first in our series for this calendar year, 2024, the John Henry Newman Lecture Series. As you know, for those who have attended in the past, the series is held in the honor of St. John Henry Newman, who was an English philosopher, theologian, he's a poet, historian, writer, and importantly, an ardent supporter of the liberal arts. And so at this point, it's important for me to take a pause and to thank the Office of the Provost and thank the Office of the Dean for sponsoring and co-sponsoring this event tonight and truly raising up the mission of this great university. Our recently adopted strategic plan calls out our responsibility as a university to prepare our students to be active and successful contributors in this diverse democracy. And as part of that, to use the city of Philadelphia as a historical learning laboratory. And so it's with that in mind that I am really proud to welcome Jeff Rosen, who, as you heard, is the CEO and president of the National Constitution Center, which was founded and funded by Congress to educate the United States public about the Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. At LaSalle, we are, of course, proud of our own political science department and our graduate education department's cooperative relationship with the National Constitution Center through a formalized memorandum of understanding which helps to strengthen the classical and liberal arts education at LaSalle. President Rosen was named the National Constitution Center president in 2013. He's a graduate of Harvard College, Oxford University, where he was a Marshall Scholar, and also a graduate of the Yale Law School. His book, Conversations with RBG, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg on Life, Love, Liberty, and Law, is based on his relationship and dialogues with her and is well known amongst the many publications that President Rosen has authored. His talk this evening is going to focus on his newest book, which I was happy to purchase a copy of and dive into just recently, titled The Pursuit of Happiness and How Classical Writers on Virtue Inspired the Founders and Defined America. I had the privilege of being at the National Constitution last night, the National Constitution Center last night for his talk with the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, and there are a couple things that, if you will, give me the privilege of sharing with you from that conversation. At one point, Goldberg asked President Rosen how we get the message out regarding the work of, and I quote, I hope I'm quoting accurately, I know you'll correct me if I'm not, how we get the word out regarding the work of restraining our worst and dictatorial impulses. How do we get the word out regarding the work that we need to do as a society to restrain our worst and dictatorial impulses? And Rosen responded this way, by having conversations like this. And so too, we have a conversation again like this evening. And in my review of his book, I went to the chapter on justice because of how much justice means to us in the LaSallian world. As we know, it's one of the core principles of LaSallian education. And I'm sure, and I apologize for perhaps stealing some of your thunder, but in your work, in taking notes on the works that formed the basis of the book that President Rosen is going to speak this evening, he wrote sonnets. He wrote for himself sonnets. And I want to quote for you the sonnet that he wrote on the chapter that's titled Justice. And here, Rosen his notes are related to Seneca's piece on anger. Injustice anywhere roils our fate. We're bound in mutuality of light, condemn all wrong with force, but not with hate. Self-mastered calm will gird us for the fight. From Socrates to Dr. King, the way past hate is pure compassion, agape. And so it is really a great pleasure to ask President Rosen to join us this evening in dialogue and to talk about his newest book. Professor Rosen, please. President Rosen, I should say.
President Allen,
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, President Allen, for that meaningful introduction. I'm so glad that sonnet caught your eye, and thanks for sharing it. Grateful also to Professor Mark Thomas for bringing me here and for all of your wonderful work with the NCC and with LaSalle. And hello, friends. I'm so honored to talk to you tonight. I know you've been studying some of these classical writers in your class, and I just started studying them too during COVID, unexpectedly. I'd never read them before. So I want to tell you the story of how I came to read these wonderful books that you're studying now and how they transform my understanding of the pursuit of happiness. So I'd love to walk around. If I put down this mic, can I be heard? Or let's try that, because it's much better if I can move around and wave my hands. Can you hear me? Great, okay. So during COVID, I was reading Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin, when he was in his 20s, decided to achieve moral perfection, to be a perfect person. And he made a list of virtues that he thought he should work on every day. And they were temperance, prudence, industry, order. And then he saved the one he found hardest for last, humility. A Quaker friend told him he was too vain, so he put that one on his list. And every night, he decided to pick a particular virtue. He'd focus on one virtue a week and make an X mark next to the place where he fell short. So if he's doing temperance one week and he found, reviewing the day, he'd lost his temper, he would put an X mark. And then he was going to work on the next virtue, and he thought, in 13 weeks, if I would do one virtue a week, maybe I'll get a little bit better. So he tried this for a while, for about a month, and he found it was very depressing, because every night there'd be all these X marks, and he kept falling short of all the virtues. And eventually he found it so daunting that he gave up, but he was glad that he tried. He said he felt he was a better person for having tried. I knew about this system because I tried it with a friend a couple years ago. A rabbi in our synagogue said there's this great system for moral improvement. It's called musar, which is the Hebrew word for character improvement. And there are 13 virtues, and give it a shot. So a friend and I tried it for a while, and we every night would make X marks where we fell short. Like Ben Franklin, we found it incredibly depressing because there were all these X marks. But like Franklin, we also felt that we were improved by the effort. I hadn't realized when we did it that it was basically the Hebrew version of Ben Franklin's 13 Virtues. And that was because a Hasidic rabbi in the 18th century heard about Franklin from a Polish count and basically translated his system into Hebrew and made it available for Jewish people. And it's still practiced today, and it's basically the Franklin system in Hebrew. Okay, I knew about all that, but it was during COVID that I saw that Franklin chose as the motto for his project something from Cicero. I think you've been reading some Cicero. This was a book by called the Tusculan Disputations, and it said, "Without virtue, happiness cannot be." All right, interesting enough. A few weeks later, I was at the University of Virginia, and they are founded by Thomas Jefferson, and there's a lot of Thomas Jefferson stuff everywhere. And on the wall at the University of Virginia was a list of 12 virtues that Thomas Jefferson wrote for his daughters. And they looked almost exactly like Ben Franklin's. They're like industry, resolution, order. They all had little mottos, like never put off for tomorrow. What you can do today is resolution. Or if you're angry, count to 10, if very angry, count to 100. That was silence. All sorts of good advice. But what struck me during COVID was first seeing that Franklin came up with almost the same virtues as Jefferson, and that he also picked as his motto this book by Cicero called the Tusculan Disputations that I just never heard of. And then it turns out when Jefferson was old, people would write to him all the time saying, what's the secret of happiness? Obviously, if you wanted to know the secret of happiness, you'd write to Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, who came up with that phrase, the pursuit of happiness. And he would send a passage from Cicero from the Tusculan Disputations that basically read as following. He who is tranquil in mind, who is neither exalted by undue exuberance or depressed by wanton despondency, he is the tranquil man of whom we are in quest, he is the happy man. So that idea that tranquility of soul and balance and not being too exuberant or too despondent, but finding the middle way was the secret of happiness, is summed up by Jefferson. So after reading how central this Cicero book was to Jefferson and Franklin, I thought I got to read the Cicero book, but what else to read? I found this reading list that Jefferson would send to basically kids who were going to law school, who would write to him and say, what should I read to prepare myself? And it was this very arduous reading schedule of literature, politics, history, philosophy, and he prescribed the time of day you're supposed to read everything. He said you've got to be very disciplined in your reading and get up very early before dawn, and before sunrise read philosophy, because that's the toughest. And then after the sunrise and breakfast, history and political science. And then after lunch, math and astronomy, and then after dinner you're allowed some literature and Shakespeare and poetry, and then go to bed, and then keep this up every day. Very vigorous reading schedule. There was one section that really caught my eye, and it was called Ethics or Natural Religion. And at the top of that list was the Cicero book, along with other Stoic and ancient Greek and Roman philosophers, like Marcus Aurelius for his Meditations, which you know, Epictetus, Seneca, and also Enlightenment philosophers. I think you just read John Locke recently in class. So this religion section didn't include Locke's 2 treatises on government, which may have been the one you read, but his essay concerning human understanding. And also other works of Enlightenment moral philosophy by people like Francis Hutcheson and Lord Kames and Lord Bolingbroke. These are figures from the Scottish Enlightenment and the Whig tradition. So I said, okay, I've had this great education, and I was so fortunate to have a wonderful liberal arts education, and it's so inspiring that you are studying the liberal arts here in this great university surrounded by this beautiful art. And I went to college and I majored in English and government, and I studied Puritan theology of all things, and I found that I was completely unconvinced by Puritan theology because it had very rigorous rules about how you couldn't achieve salvation by reason, but only by faith, and even if you had faith, it was a matter of random choice about whether or not you were ultimately saved or not. And that didn't strike me as satisfying, but I was kind of looking for an alternative that would give me guidance about how to lead a good life, a purpose-driven life, free from dogma or authority or doctrine. And what I didn't realize, because all these books on Jefferson's reading list just fell out of the curriculum when I was in college, was that this is exactly the question that the ancient moral philosophers set out to answer. So here's what I did during COVID. I woke up before sunrise, because I was inspired by Jefferson's schedule, read from the wisdom literature, and as you heard from President Allen, I wrote these sonnets kind of summing up the essence of what I was reading every day. This seems like a completely weird practice, I understand, and I'd never written sonnets before. There was something about the balance and harmony of the wisdom that made me want to kind of sum it up in an easily remembered form, and then it just surprised me when I learned that a lot of people in the founding era also wrote sonnets to the wisdom literature. The most importantly, Phyllis Wheatley, the great black poet, the first black American poet, comes over to America in chains. She's enslaved. Her master and mistress allow her to be educated with the kids in the household, and they read all these great books, Cicero and Marcus Aurelius. She's so inspired by this classical literature that she writes poems about virtue and happiness. She sends them to George Washington. He acclaims her as one of the great poets of her age. She goes over to London and she's an international celebrity. Professor Henry Louis Gates calls her the Oprah of her day. She was just so acclaimed for being so great. But here's the amazing thing. People couldn't believe, because they were racist in those days, that a black poet could be great. So the city of Boston held a trial to determine whether or not she'd written her own poems. And John Hancock, the author of the guy who signed the Declaration of Independence with that big signature, along with other famous Boston, preachers and professors, examine her and try to decide whether or not she'd actually written her own poems. She passes the exam with flying colors, and they assert that Phyllis Wheatley indeed is the author of these great poems, and that makes her a total international celebrity. It's completely stunning. Really striking that George Washington treated her with great respect and thanked her for the poems and acclaimed her genius. Guess who did not treat her with respect? Thomas Jefferson. And it's really disgraceful that in his notes on the state of Virginia, he has a really racist passage, is the only word for it, where he denigrates Phyllis Wheatley's abilities. He said no black person can be a good poet because black people are intellectually inferior to whites, and just goes on this racist rant that is shocking, is the only word for it. So despite Jefferson's resistance, her genius was recognized, and she died young, acclaimed for her abilities. This is striking to me on a whole bunch of levels, including the fact that summing up this wisdom, this classical wisdom in poetry, is such a widely shared impulse. And that's why I wrote the sonnets, and that led to the book that followed. The book that resulted after I'd spent a year reading the wisdom literature was an effort to figure out how did the founders apply these lessons in their own lives, and how did they understand the phrase, the pursuit of happiness. And what I learned came as a revelation, because today, of course, we think of happiness as feeling good, but for the founders, happiness meant being good, not the pursuit of pleasure, but the pursuit of virtue. But in particular, they had something in mind when they talked about virtue that is not intuitive, at least today. And that's virtue means self-mastery, self-improvement, character improvement, being your best self, using all of your faculties of reason to moderate your unreasonable passions or emotions so you can achieve the calm tranquility that will allow you to be your best self and serve others. That idea of using reason to master your passions or emotions comes from Pythagoras. I didn't know, who knew? That Pythagoras not only invented the triangle, which we know, and he also invented the harmonic system, all the beautiful harmonies of triads and fifths and intervals come from the great Pythagoras. In addition to all that, he lived on the Isle of Croton in Italy, and he encouraged his disciples who lived with him to first be good and then like a god. Basically, you're supposed to try to become perfect. How do you become perfect? Just by the habits of daily self-discipline. Getting up early, moderate eating and drinking, and lots of reading. His eating rules were a little unusual. He was a big vegetarian, and he said you can only eat vegetables ground up in powder, but under no circumstances eat beans. If you eat beans, this is the death penalty. If you eat beans under pain of death, he said, rather die than even touch a bean field. So there's one time when his disciples are being pursued by the attackers, and the attackers catch up to one of them and say, I'll spare your life if you'll just tell me one thing. Tell me the secret. Why is it that you won't eat beans? And she said, I would rather die than tell you the secret. And she bites off her tongue and spits it at him and runs away. She'll never give up the secret. Why won't you eat beans? So why didn't they eat beans? Well, the general authority is that beans resemble fetuses, and therefore they have life in them, and therefore you can't eat beans. although I was at a talk the other night, a book talk, and I told this story, and a guy stood up in the back and said, I am from the Isle of Croton in Italy. In fact, on the Isle of Croton, there is a genetic defect that means that if you have it and you eat beans, then you are very ill. So in fact, Pythagoras was saving the people for this genetic, and who knows. Pythagoras is very, very inspiring because in addition to just being a model of perfection and self-discipline, he came up with this distinction between reason and passion. And remember, passion is pathos, reason is logos, and Plato turned this into a three-part division with reason in the head, passion in the heart, and desire in the stomach. And the goal of life is, imagine reason like a charioteer, and the charioteer has two horses in front of him, the noble and the appetitive or passionate horses, and reason should align them so they're both pulling in the same direction. It's a beautiful metaphor because it gives the sense we're not supposed to lack emotion at all or lack passion, quite the opposite. We just want to temper it so that it can be productive, to resist unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear. And all you know what that means, because it just distracts you. It kind of gets you off the right path. Also, resist getting too much in your own head with your own ego, like wild ambition or greed or avarice, so that instead you can have the calm tranquility of mind, the temperance of mind that really lets you be strong and effective. And that's why it's, for some of the philosophers, happiness is temperance or tranquility of mind so that you can achieve that excellence. There's that famous definition of happiness by Aristotle, excellence of the soul in conformity with virtue, an activity of the soul in conformity with virtue or excellence. It's not self-defining, those terms, virtue and excellence, and therefore it doesn't really capture, at least to my ears, what the path is. But the path is self-mastery, self-reliance, inner strength, so you can connect to the divine light in all and be your best self and serve others. It's really being a lifelong learner. And it's so striking when older folks hear about this wisdom for the first time, they, or at least the classical version of it, resonate to the idea that for many of the ancients and the people who practice this throughout history, the real way to achieve this path is through lifelong learning, is through deep reading. And you guys are starting off and you're reading for class, obviously, but what you're doing is developing the habits that will let you keep reading throughout your life. And what was so inspiring to me about the founders is what incredibly deep readers they were. They fell short of many of their ideals, and I'll talk about those in a sec. But you see Adams and Jefferson when they're old, 80 years old, they've gone through their whole life, they fought the revolution together, then they split over politics and they founded the first political parties. They're like, it's as polarized as it is today. But then they reconcile because Abigail Adams brings them back together. What do they want to do when they're old? They're writing letters about what they've read. And Adams is so excited when he hears that Pythagoras is supposed to have traveled to the East and read the Hindu Vedas and the Bhagavad Gita. But then he says there's an English translation of the Bhagavad Gita that Joseph Priestley was completing, and Adams doesn't know if Priestley lived to complete it because he recently died. And Jefferson says, good news, Priestley lived, he finished the translation, I'll send it to you from Paris. And Adams says this will show the connections between the wisdom of the East and the West and the wisdom of the Bhagavad Gita, which Gandhi summed up as renounce and enjoy. Renounce attachment to external events and activities and enjoy freedom and immortality is the wisdom of the Gita. The Dhammapada puts it in a different way. We are what we think. Life is shaped by the mind. And John Adams, of all people, was really struck by the connections between that and Pythagoras, and he just wanted to share his discoveries with his old friend, Thomas Jefferson. So just to share the takeaway for this project for me, you fall short every day. the injunction to be perfect. Jesus said that, Socrates said that. It's impossible. How could you possibly love to do it? You can't. But it's a pursuit. And every day you try to be a little more perfect, and you just try to use your time as well as you can. And think of those reading lists, and think of those men and women reading and growing until they're old. Just setting aside time every day to read is a radical act of self-assertion. And the habit that I took away from this intense year of reading, which I had never done before, reading that intensely, is just to set aside time in the morning every day when I'm only allowed to read. And when I wake up, whether it's before the sunrise or not, the temptation is, of course, every day, what's the email? What am I going to browse? What's the newspaper say? But I have a rule that I can't do that. I must read a book, an actual book. And it's like a superpower. You just learn so much. And just today, I woke up, wanted to browse and check my email, read this Webster Haynes debates on nullification and slavery in the 1830s. And I found that Thomas Jefferson actually endorsed a broad vision of congressional power that he later rejected and was totally hypocritical about slavery. So it was a really big thing. And it was just because and it's just a habit. And that's the whole point. It's like those Franklin lists. You can't, in the abstract, be temperate and prudent. And when I did the Franklin Project for the first time, I was going through a tough time in my life, and I couldn't be temperate because I was losing my temper a lot, and there were all these X marks. But when you just realize that really the path is not how you get the X mark on any particular moment, but just being on the quest, and in particular the habits of deep reading. So that's the big takeaway that I want to share with you. You're readers because you're here. You're readers. I mean, how marvelous that you're studying this stuff in high school. I wish I'd done that, which I didn't. And it took me decades more to find this great literature. But just keep it up. And it does. It doesn't have to be classical literature. It can be any. But you know what the difference between a book and a website is. You got to read books. And best of all, read primary sources so you can make up your own mind. Don't let people tell you what to think. Don't get your ideas from, the internet or YouTube or ChatGPT. Make up your own mind. Think as you will and speak as you think. Tacitus says is the definition of freedom of speech. And Jefferson falls short of many ideals, and I want to talk about slavery now. But the one thing he got right was what he called the illimitable freedom of the human mind. That we can't surrender to others the power to tell us what we think, because we don't even entirely control our own thoughts. They just present themselves to us, and then they're processed by our reasoning minds. And I can't give you the power to tell me what to think, because I can't entirely tell myself what to think. That's the product of my reason, and I can't alienate my reason. And that's why the freedom of conscience is an unalienable right, and that's what Jefferson meant when he said the pursuit of happiness is an unalienable right. I can't alienate it when I move to form a government from the state of nature, even if I want to. That's not the case for property. You just read John Locke, and John Locke says that in a state of nature, all have certain natural rights, including life, liberty, and property. Yes, we do. But property is an alienable right. I can alienate to government the power to regulate my property. I have to do that because unless there's some regulation of the economy, then we can't have a functioning economy. But I can't alienate my right to think as I wish and speak as I think, even if I live in a tyrannical government like Putin, where he's going and killing his enemies because he doesn't like what they say, which he just did the other day. Our president can't kill his enemies because we have a separation of powers and a constitution, and a president is not a king or a czar. But even Putin can't tell people what to think, because the mind must be free if you exercise it and read and think for yourself. And that's what I know you're going to do with your deep reading. I want to say what surprised me about Jefferson and the other founders and slavery. So far from denying the hypocrisy of slavery and virtue, they acknowledged it. There's an amazing quotation from Patrick Henry, the guy who said, "Give me liberty and give me death." And in this great speech about liberty, and he compared the white Americans to being the slaves of Britain and said, we've got to be free. How could he denounce the slavery of white people to Britain and himself owned slaves. The amazing thing is he didn't even try to reconcile the hypocrisy. He said, is it not amazing that I myself, who believe that slavery of any kind violates natural rights, myself own slaves? I will not justify it. I will not attempt to. It is simple avarice or greed I cannot do with the inconvenience of living without slavery. In other words, he liked the lifestyle that slavery made possible. He lived in a nice house. Everyone else did the work for him because they were enslaved, and he just didn't want to give it up. And the amazing thing is that all the founders recognized that that was the basic thing. Jefferson, who's really denounced slavery in a big way, especially when he was young, also said it was avarice or greed that led states like South Carolina and Georgia not to want to end the international slave trade, even though Virginia was willing to do it because they didn't need to import more enslaved people. And in his moments of self-awareness, which were not frequent because Jefferson had incredible capacity for self-denial, he said, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, and believe that there would be eternal punishment for the sin of slavery. So it doesn't excuse Jefferson's hypocrisy in denouncing what he himself indulged, because he had he was this incredibly extravagant lifestyle, and he was constantly buying love seats and gilded mirrors and all these fancy clothes, and he constructed Monticello like some fantasy palace of the Enlightenment, denying the fact that he's not only surrounded by enslaved labor, but the people closest to him are his own children. And it's just amazing. The kids he had with Sally Hemings were his closest. He called them his, servants in the house, and he pretended they were all his family, but they're actually his kids. Sally Hemings began her whatever you want to call it, a sexual relationship, because it was hardly consensual, with Jefferson. She's 16, and he's in his 40s in Paris, and they go and they begin their relationship, and she's pregnant, and she has to make a decision. Am I going to go back to America? Because Somerset's decision has just been issued by Lord Mansfield, and she could have stayed in Britain and been freed according to the law by remaining in Britain. She agrees to go back only in exchange for Jefferson's promise that he will free their children on his death. And in fact, he keeps his promise. He frees only a handful of people, that's 7 people in his lifetime. 2 of his kids ran away, and he freed one of them during his lifetime. And then on his death, he freed 2 more, plus some of their relatives. And that's it. And the other of the people in his enslaved population had to be sold to pay his debts, and mothers are separated from kids, and it's just appalling. And he's constantly denouncing the immorality of debt, and says that one generation has no right to bind another and pass along their debts. And that justifies his radical theory that there should be a new constitutional convention every 19 years, and people should draft laws and constitutions anew because one generation cannot bind another. Irony is not the right word for it. The hypocrisy of the fact that he imposed all of these debts on his own white children and had to sell or free his black children in order to pay for them is a kind of karmic comeuppance for his hypocrisy. So learning about the moral framework in which these founders operated does not excuse or justify their hypocrisy, but it does help us understand that they recognized it, and that the glorious freedom ideals that they sometimes upheld and at other times betrayed inspired others, including the greatest abolitionists, to hold America to its best ideals. So it was David Walker's appeal, which invoked the Declaration and demanded that its promises be made a reality. And then there's the great Frederick Douglass. And the story is just so inspiring, because Frederick Douglass, first of all, what does he feel most enchained by? Not only the physical chains of his enslavement, but when his master stopped his reading lessons. His mistress, the wife of the guy who owned him, was beginning to teach him how to read. And then the master found out about this and said, don't do this, because if he knows how to read, he's going to want freedom. So the lessons stopped. And he said at that moment he felt this crushing blow, that the attempt to shackle his mind was even more painful in some ways than the attempt to maintain his shackled body. And he resolved, I've got to learn how to read. So he goes onto the streets of Baltimore and he pays these guys who are his age in bread to teach him how to read. And then he buys this book with the bread, or in exchange, and it's called The Columbian Orator. And The Columbian Orator is just a collection of selections from the classical moral writings, some of which you're reading, some of which I read, also selections from Ben Franklin, and these selections from these Irish patriots who are denouncing British colonialism. And he's so inspired by this book of fire that he resolves to become the greatest freedom fighter of his age. And that is what leads to these astonishing speeches like What to a Slave is the 4th of July and other masterworks of freedom, all of which are so informed by his classical reading. And then after the Reconstruction and the Civil War, he talks about self-reliance and praises John Quincy Adams, the abolitionist president, for achieving the kind of self-mastery that the wisdom demands. And then you have other freedom fighters like Ida B. Wells and King on the Mall. And King on the Mall, President Allen read from that poem, the King sonnet. He's calling America to account because he loves it so much. And he's so patriotic that he's saying the arc of justice bends upward, and you've got to be true to your ideals. Stop betraying the ideals of the Declaration. It's a promissory note, and you've got to make good on it. And that's all informed by Dr. King's classical reading and his reading in the Bible. So don't let anyone tell you that this work you're reading, this great Enlightenment classical tradition is for white people or for Christian people or for men. It is for all of us, and it has inspired women and black people and Jews and people of all backgrounds and religions and nationalities across the ages to demand freedom and demand our equal rights, which we are endowed by our Creator with, and our natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the pursuit of happiness is the exercise of these rights. That's what we gotta keep remembering. The pursuit of happiness is not you do you, or enraged to engage, or get as much sex and drugs and rock and roll as you can get, because that's not going to last, and it feels good for a sec, but then it's not going to feel good the next minute. The right to pursue happiness is the right to read all these great books and then to live their ideals and to inspire others to do it and to demand freedom and to work for freedom, and you can only do that if you are self-mastered and your best self. I also found this great and important connection that I missed before between personal self-government and political self-government. For the founders are very afraid of democracy, and they're afraid it's going to fail. They're hopeful, but they're afraid it's going to fail. Why? Because all the ancient democracies fell. Greece and Rome all fell to demagogues like Caesar and Cleon, who would come and flatter the Athenian assembly and offer them luxuries or, these bread and circuses in exchange for giving up their liberty, and then they install themselves as demagogues and authoritarians. And I found this amazing letter from Thomas Jefferson when he gets the Constitution for the first time from Madison. He says, I'm afraid of two things. First, there's no Bill of Rights, and second, I'm afraid that in the future there's going to be some demagogue who's going to lose an election by a few votes, cry foul, flatter the people, enlist the states who voted for him, and refuse to leave office and install himself as a dictator for life. You just can't make up the obvious resonances today. And Hamilton is also afraid of a demagogue like Caesar who's going to flatter the people and win an election by a majority and then refuse to leave and install himself as a dictator for life. And Madison is constantly talking about the dangers of the mob, because that's what he learned from his classical philosophy. And he says, in all large assemblies of any character composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. There's that reason-passion thing. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob. That was the classical teaching. When you've got a really big group of people deliberating face to face, like the Athenian Assembly, which is 6,000 people, then Cleon, who's the demagogue, comes in and says to the people, you got to invade, in the Peloponnesian War, and Athens loses because he's flattering the people into a reckless decision in order to shore up his own power. So that's why the whole Constitution is designed to slow down deliberation, to separate powers, to prevent all the power from being in one branch of government, so that mobs can't form. And when they do, they'll dissipate, and people will lose their passion, their anger, and their unreasonable passions, so that cool reason can prevail. But in order for cool reason to prevail, that requires individual citizens, each of us one by one, to master ourselves, not to vote for the guy who flatters us, or the angriest person, or the demagogue, but the wisest person, the most deliberate person, the person who will serve the public interest rather than their own selfish ambitions. It's asking a lot of citizens, and the founders aren't sure it'll work. And Washington, at the end of his life, fears the people won't have enough virtue because of factions or political parties, and Hamilton thinks the president isn't strong enough. Only Madison is a little bit optimistic because he has faith in a new technology, the media. And he hopes that people will read newspapers, which are a new way of mass communication, the broadside press, and they'll read arguments like the Federalist Papers in the newspaper, and they'll take the time to read it, and they'll deliberate about it with their representatives in coffee houses, and cool reason will spread slowly across the land. Obviously, it doesn't sound like today. I mean, this is not Facebook, it's not Twitter, it's not Instagram. We're the opposite. No one's reading, there's no cool reason, it's instant reaction, it's enraged to engage, it's own the libs or own the conservatives. Any attempt to deliberate or to compromise or even to have a productive conversation is lost in filter bubbles, echo chambers, and angry tweets or X's or whatever they're called now. So we have a real problem. A very serious problem in America, which is that the founders hope for this kind of cool deliberation, and the technologies that would allow people slowly to converge on common reason are being undermined in so many ways. But that just puts the responsibility even more on us. And that's why it's very important. It's not just that you vote. It's not enough just to vote. You should certainly vote, of course, but you've got to vote thoughtfully and wisely, and you've got to do more than just vote. You've got to educate yourself and make yourself strong, and decide what you think, and don't listen to these slogans on both sides with people saying outrageous, extreme things just to get the people who aren't reading and thinking for themselves excited, right? If you just read the memes or get the news from Instagram or whatever, you're just gonna, it's just nonsense is what it is. It's factionalism and the worst kind of extremism. So it's very hard because you got to have the discipline and you wake up and do your reading and stuff like that. But I know that you're going to do that. I'd love to have a conversation with you and hear what you think, but I just want to end by expressing such admiration for you for having started this really important task early. You've got to do it, and the habits that you're developing now will take you through your life. Like, I don't remember the substance of what I learned at any stage of my wonderful education, high school, college, and all that, but you have the habits, and then you can keep doing it as adults, and you got to do it. And regardless of what happens with American democracy, and who knows what's going to happen, you'll just have that superpower and just keep, and it becomes even more meaningful when you get old. Like when now you're doing it to do well in school and you're just beginning to encounter this stuff. It's after that you've done your work and you're trying to lead a fulfilling life when you're older, especially in the second half of your life. That kind of deep reading is the greatest power and the greatest consolation for this pursuit of happiness. Thank you so much.